Good morning, students. I am Maureen McCarthy. I am the program director for the National Security Forum of Nevada, and it is my great pleasure to have our esteemed expert with us today. Our thought leader is Tegan Blaine. Dr. Tegan Blaine is the Senior Advisor for Environment and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace, based in Washington, D.C., but currently living in that lovely village behind her in Switzerland. So she is coming to you today on the video and next week during her session from Switzerland. So she will be talking to us about the issues of climate security, particularly the issues of conflict and migration. So with that, Tegan, I would ask you to take it away and give us a little bit of insight into what we mean by climate security.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, Maureen, and for all the students out there. I'm so pleased to be with you today virtually, and I look forward to being with you live next week. Climate security. Climate security is basically the idea that climate change amplifies fragility or amplifies the risk of conflict. Globally, climate change is likely to have impacts on food, water, health security, all of these human security issues. But it's also likely to lead to more emergencies like hurricanes, droughts, floods, all of that kind of really fun stuff. But it becomes increasingly important when societies, and particularly governments, are already fragile or already at the risk of conflict. And then climate change stresses an already weak system. The way that I think about fragility is that at its core, it's a breakdown of the social contract between government and the population. And oftentimes the response is about strengthening state legitimacy and effectiveness. Climate change basically threatens the social contract. We know that there tends to be political unrest and occasionally violence following a drought or flood that impacts crop production, for example, and really threatens people's food supply. We also know that after an emergency is a critical time that unrest and political stability tend to occur, especially if a government fails to respond adequately. And climate change increases the possibility that all of that's going to happen. Now, I recognize that you all have an interest in talking about migration in particular, but I do want to make one last note. Generally, when we're talking about climate security, oftentimes we're talking about climate change impacts that are hard to adapt to and what that means for governments. However, I did want to point out that there are also risks and kind of risks of conflict inherent in the response to climate change. So right now, there's a global agreement that's encouraging a global transition to a green economy. And that transition is going to shift demand for mineral resources and fossil fuels, which could potentially increase conflict around, for example, mining in fragile countries, or disturb political power sharing that's been built up around the profits from fossil fuel sales. So I'm sure that we're going to be talking a lot about how the impacts of climate change threaten to increase conflict. But I did want to just point out that responding to climate change and trying to reduce the causes for climate change add an additional risk because it's a major economic transition. And that also can produce risks of violence and increased fragility in countries around the world.
Well, it's great that you mentioned that point because students from Nevada certainly know a lot about lithium mining. And
Yes,
of course,
indeed.
we need lithium in order to have alternative energy, in order to have batteries. And lithium mining is a big issue because we have lithium mines in Nevada. And of course, there's competition for lithium resources in order to support a renewable energy world. So I'm really glad you made that point, that it's not just the impacts of the changing climate, it's the impacts of what we do about the changing climate.
It is, and I'm glad to, I had forgotten that, of course, in Nevada, there is lithium mining, and that's
Yes,
very, very relevant for your
big
students.
deal here.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that.
So, when it comes to issues of migration, we hear the phrase climate refugees. Um, what does that mean? Who are they and where are they? And probably more importantly, in a short introduction, um, what can we effectively do to help mitigate that situation, either to help them stay where they want to be home or to help them on their migration journeys?
Yeah, it's a really tough issue. Number one, I would say that the phrase climate migrants is misleading. And the
Good.
reason that I would say that is it's very difficult to say that any conflicts or any decisions to leave home and to migrate are directly due to climate change. Normally, those kinds of choices happen for a variety of reasons, and they're not just due to one thing. And so climate change is also a complex topic. And if people describe why they're choosing to migrate, for example, they'll often refer to things like crop failure, lack of water, things like that. And they won't necessarily draw the conclusion that these events are happening because of climate change. And so it's really, really difficult to draw causal connections. That said, we do have increasing evidence that climate change is involved. For example, you might have heard or discussed in class about the conflict in Syria and the devastation that's happened over in that area over the last few years. In that case, a drought complicated what was already a politically fragile situation and caused enormous devastation. More recently, you probably remember that two hurricanes struck Honduras within, I think, 7 or 8 days of each other last year.
Right.
They destroyed crops. Those hurricanes displaced 500,000 people and impacted many millions more. It's very likely that climate change directly led to the fact that those kinds of hurricanes were happening in quick succession and led to a surge at the US border. But would those people say that they were climate refugees? Probably not. They probably say, my home has been destroyed, my crops have been wiped out, I don't know where to go for help. And so it's a little bit challenging here to talk about um, who the climate migrants are and whether they'd even call themselves that. Now, that said, I do think it's a really critical issue. Um, as the impacts of climate change become more and more real, we're likely to experience increasing stresses on food security, water security, physical security, health security. We've seen the destruction that can happen from challenges to health systems this year with the whole COVID crisis. And so all of these things that climate change is impacting impact the institutional systems that are meant to respond. And already we're having to have conversations about what does it mean as sea level rises for people who live on small island developing states that are very low to the ocean and that are facing significant changes in their territory. We're also beginning to realize that probably within a couple of generations, there will likely be huge swaths of what are currently inhabited geographies that are really seeing annual temperatures far outside the norms of what human society has been in over the last 10,000 years. And that's in Asia, that's in Central America and parts of South America, that's in the Sahel region of Africa, that's in the Middle East. And so, we're looking at the possibilities of massive migration. Is it all going to happen at once? Absolutely not. Is it going to happen in terms of people clamoring to come to the United States? Most likely not. Some of it may be internal to countries. Some of it may be within regions. Some of it is likely to be people seeking to move further afield. And so there are huge climate security issues that we can start to prepare for now. But that whole issue of how you begin to define this person as a climate migrant or a climate refugee versus that person, that is very tough to do, even though I do think it's going to be a very real problem.
That's an excellent perspective, and I really appreciate you saying that. How we define them may not be how they define themselves, and so that's an important point. In our last minute in this recording, would you just give some food for thought to the students for things you would like them to be thinking about that we can discuss in more detail next week?
You know, I think one of the interesting things about climate change is we actually do have time to prepare for some of the risks around climate change. Certainly, some of those things are already happening, but for me, it's one of those issues that is starting now and also in the future. And so we do actually have time to prepare for these changes. But the question is, how do we get ahead of them now? How do we begin to address the growing inequalities in a world where countries in temperate geographies with more stable and potentially more responsive political systems and economies are not hit as hard as poorer countries? How do we begin to deal with the fact that there are international equity issues concerned as well here, the fact that climate change is rooted in the historical release of greenhouse gases that have fueled the development you know, of our country, for example, but it's primarily affecting countries that have not historically released so many greenhouse gases. And then how do we deal with kind of the stresses that people are going to face coming down the road that are going to impact their social systems, impact their economic systems, impact food and water security? And how do we prepare as a global community to deal with those problems humanely and prepare governments to deal with them directly as well? Those are enormous challenges, but we have an opportunity to really start planning for it now. And I look forward to hearing your students' ideas.
Excellent. Well, I'm thrilled to have had your discussion. And students, please join us. Tegan will be talking to you next Wednesday, the 26th of May at 8 o'clock, the early session, since she's coming to us from Europe. We really appreciate her continuing her long day at that point. And I have to tell you, Tegan, that our students are steeped in climate issues. We live in the driest state in the union, and we're in a drought. So they have something to share with the world about adapting to stressful climate situations. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to meeting all of the students in this program next week.
Fantastic.